Nurses of Reddit, what were the most haunting things someone said on their deathbed? Not a nurse. Was an EMTB on the 911 unit that got a call about a hit and run. Cops were on scene first. The area of the city I worked in was rough. Some guy and his GF had got into a fight in the parking lot. It ended with the guy running over his GF, then backing up over her. Needless to say, she wasn't doing well, and her vitals were tanking. We loaded her up, with a fireman and police officer joined with us in the back of the rig. She kept mumbling, "Tell my mom. Please tell my mom," and naturally I figured it was her asking us to let her mom know she was hurt. The hospital takes care of that, and I put it out of my mind rather quick as we were working over her. She flatlined before we arrived. They did not get her back. My partner was finishing up her paperwork, and we turned to give her wallet back to the staff. The nurse on duty, who I knew pretty well, was reading a dirty piece of paper. She looked disgusted. When I asked what was up, she simply put the piece of paperwork down. It was a letter that was picked up near her purse on scene. She had gotten accepted into a college. I realized then that in the ambulance, she was asking us to tell her mom she got into college. That is a deep sadness I have never forgotten. So this happened a couple of years ago. We had an ex-gang guy who was dying of cancer, and he confessed that he was the gang hitman for many years. He wanted to confess to all the killings and show the police where the bodies are buried. He would get closure knowing that the surviving families of his victims find out where they are buried. We had to get the hospital legal team involved, cause we had no policies to deal with that. Cops got involved, and the dude confessed to gang murders from decades ago. I had a patient whose memory had been fading for years. It's weird, right before a patient dies, sometimes they'll suddenly be doing a lot better. Anyway, he thought I was his late wife. I played along and just listened to him while he recalled his engagement, his wedding, his first childbirth, and a few other memories for me. At one point, he says, "Oh, Irene, there you are. Sorry, you know my eyes aren't as good as they used to be." Well, thank you for listening to an old man tell his stories. I hope you have great stories to tell one day too. I'm coming, Irene. And then he passed. He was my first long-time patient. I'm not a nurse, but I provided hospice care for a loved one, so she could die in her own home, rather than a hospital. At the end, she became convinced that taking morphine for the pain was killing her. She would lay in agony asking me for help, but refuse the pain meds. I resorted to just raising and lowering her bed to help her get comfortable. The day she died, her cat went from being aloof to sleeping on the bed with her. Cats know things. I had to tell my grandmother that dialysis would only give her another week or so to live, and it was her choice to try or not. She was in and out of consciousness at that point, and was in a clear state for the moment. She asked, "Will I die?" I said, "Yes." She looked me in the eye and smiled just a little and said, "Sometimes you gotta do what you don't want to do." She closed her eyes, squeezed my hand, and slept until she passed a day later. When things get hard, I always hear her say, "Sometimes you gotta do what you don't want to do." Not a nurse, but my grandfather was put into a 24/7 care home with severe Parkinson's. My mom and grandma had spent 4 years basically taking care of him constantly and needed a break for a couple weeks, although visiting him every other day in shifts. I went one day alone, and he looked me straight in the eye and said, "I need you to get me home so I can die. I can't do it here." I tried saying everything I could to the nurses and my family to get him home without saying what he told me. 24 hours later he got rushed to emerge. As he was dying he looked at me and said, "Don't let it bother you," and died. Still bothers me. While in hospice my grandma said to me, "There are a great many things in this world worse than dying." Then talked about how lucky she was to have lived the life she did. I had never looked at death like that before, And that conversation truly changed me and my outlook. She was the most wonderful person. She looked at me and said, "You really are a little pipsqueak." I was her favorite nurse too. I'm going home. I worked as a nurse's aide in a nursing home for just 2 months, brand new. This gentleman was assigned to my caseload the entire time I had worked there and was on hospice the whole time, but had seemed to be doing well. This night, I was working with him and he seemed off. I talked to him and explained what I was doing to care for him, but he just sounded so angry and confused. I was new to this, so I didn't know quite what to do, so I pressed on. He got so freaked out, he took his oxygen tubing and tried to wrap it around my throat to strangle me. I got away, told the nurse, and was told that confusion and aggression were common when people were dying. He needed his care regardless. I went to care for him again a few hours later, and he looked so docile, so defeated. His eyes filled with tears as he looked at me and told me, "I'm real sorry for what I did earlier, ma'am. That's not who I am. I'm so sorry." I told him it was okay and that I just wanted to make him comfortable. He thanked me and said the line, "I'm going home." He just kept repeating it and sounded so urgent. "I'm going home. I'm going home. I'm going home." I thought he was still confused. He passed away 1.5 hours later, right after my shift was over. I was the one to hear his last words. Upon learning that he passed away, I immediately thought of those last words. Sticks with me to this day. This was almost 12 years ago, and I don't think I'll ever forget. Not a nurse, but it seems that most people here are recounting last things people said prior to dying, so here's mine. My grandmother who raised me had pulmonary fibrosis and was in and out of the hospital multiple times leading up to her passing. My mother-in-law worked as a nurse at the hospital my grandmother had been admitted to and called me letting me know that her vitals were bad and I should rush to there ASAP. I made it and sat at her bedside while she had her CPAP mask on. I knew but didn't know at the same time that this was the last time I was going to see her alive when I first arrived. I held her hand and cried while begging inside to let me feel her pain so she wouldn't suffer. I told her I loved her and everything was going to be okay while tried to hide my tears. She looked at me very deeply with love in her eyes and said, "It's okay, Majo, I love you, but I need to prepare myself and I need you to go." That's when I felt the room change. It felt heavy and I knew this would be the last time we'd exchange words. I walked out of her room and turned around and said, "I love you," to which she replied, "No matter what happens, Majo, I'll always love you, but go." Leaving that room was the hardest thing to do, but I respected her wishes. By the time my wife and I made the 20 minutes drive home, I received the call that she passed. My Mills nurse coworkers on that floor mentioned that my grandmother had really stuck it out until I showed up to say our goodbyes. I'm not a nurse, but my grandparents passed 3 days apart from each other. My grandmother was diagnosed with lung cancer and began treatment. About halfway through, she sat everyone down and told us she felt her life was so fulfilled and would stop treatment, essentially choosing to pass peacefully. My grandfather was healthy, the type of man who went to the gym until he was 90. Just in impeccable shape and health, honestly. My grandmother was on her deathbed for a long while. In and out of consciousness, no longer communicating often, and only eating ice chips. It really tore my grandfather up, and one day he was at the grocery store and just had a heart attack and passed away within minutes. A few days later, my dad and I were sitting with my grandmother in her room. I was holding her hand and remember my dad telling her my grandfather is waiting for her whenever she is ready and she won't have to go alone. My grandmother spoke her first words in a week and said, "He's right here with me. I see him." My dad said, "What's he wearing?" Which at the time I thought it was an odd question, but she giggled and said he's in my favorite grey suit. I think we are going out. She was such a fashionable woman, so they always were so well dressed. She passed that evening. We had their funeral together, and my dad dressed him in the suit she told him my grandfather was wearing. They were so in love. Still to this day I have never seen anyone compare to what they had. A part of me feels my grandfather died of a broken heart, but also knew she needed him onto their next journey. It tears me to pieces every time I think of her last words. I know they're happy and together. I miss them both so much. The world is a little dimmer without them.